This episode is brought to you by Hero Forge. Hero Forge offers fully customizable tabletop miniatures with dozens of fantasy races and thousands of parts to choose from. Their easy-to-use design tool lets you build your perfect miniature online using a fully 3D, in-depth character creator right in your web browser. Custom minis can be made in a variety of materials, including plastic and metal options. They also offer downloadable model files so you can 3D print your own unique designs at home. Hero Forge is constantly expanding their catalog of customization options, adding new parts every week and major features like races and custom posing on a regular basis. Visit heroforge.com to start designing your custom miniature today. And check back often, new content is added every week. This is Tabletop Babble, and I'm Amber. Today on the show, I talk with game designer, writer, and cultural consultant Clio Yunsu Davis. I've had the pleasure of running a game for Clio before, as well as playing with them, and I was really happy to learn more about what they do in TTRPGs. We sat down on December 21st and chatted about LARP, the idea of playing to lose, and cultural consultation. Hi, Clio. Thank you so much for coming on the show. So for my listeners, would you please let us know who you are and what you do in the TTRPG space?
Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all. I'm Clio Yunsu Davis, they, them, and she, her pronouns. And God, what do I... So I think whenever I get asked this, you think I would have a simple answer, but I guess mostly I write, I contribute to various tabletop games, but I'm also like a LARP writer and a direct-to-fiction writer. And so sometimes these things kind of all like bleed into each other, right? And so I've also done like a card game and a few other game adjacent things.
Yeah, because I went to your website and I honestly didn't know you had one until you did your revamp. And I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, Clio does so much. And I'm always surprised. Like I play with people and I like get experience playing RPGs with them. And then I find out like there's so much more going on. So for TTRPG specifically, when did you get started?
So it was definitely after, playing. I think my dad got me started on D&D when I was 9, 10. It was like 3.5 back then. And I started amassing like role-playing books and like D20 compatible books. And I think I still have like literally all of them. And so the collecting and playing of tabletop games started at a pretty young age. And then designing them and contributing to them. LARP came first, and the card game came first, and my writing stuff came first. And weirdly, it wasn't like my intention to really it wasn't like I'm going to become a tabletop designer. I think I started getting offers for things, and I ended up really enjoying it, and I enjoyed playing them. So it made sense that designing them would also be, fun. But it was a little bit. It wasn't a planned thing. It was kind of spontaneous.
Sure. So I know a lot of times now we get these interactions and stuff, community and RPG things through being online. When you first started doing like the LARP stuff, was that mostly just like face-to-face local community stuff, or was it an online thing that started to evolve from interacting with people online?
So my first LARP experience, aside from growing up, sometimes like play pretend is basically LARP in a lot of ways, right? So my first officially dubbed LARP experience was New World Magischola, which is like the wizarding school in the US LARP. It's like what they call like a blockbuster LARP, which took place over a weekend. Yeah.
So real quick, we're here. I want to let you know, like my LARPing knowledge is very tiny.
Mm-hmm.
Like for me, True Dungeon is, I guess, what you would call that LARPing.
Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty much my experience. So, and I'm assuming not a lot of other people have a lot of LARPing. Could you explain, like, the LARPing world?
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Every time I try to summarize the LARPing world, I imagine, like, all these different sects of LARPers, like, listening in and criticizing my definition, like, no, that is far too close to immersive theater. You must, like, interject all this theory that we've amassed over the years. because some of LARP discourse is a little bit like that. But basically, it's when you're, when I boil it down, I basically just say you're role playing and you're embodying the character. So instead of like talking in third person, you're doing things in first person. Sometimes that means like, moving around in a space. But you could have a LARP where you are literally all just sitting around the table. But as long as your body, like movements and your demeanor and what you say is by and large in character, like you're speaking as your character, and not really usually describing like what your character is doing, just doing it instead or miming it, then that's LARP, more or less. And a blockbuster LARP is like a big to-do, like high production value, often like also really, really expensive.
I could imagine with costumes and props and renting a space even would probably be, yeah.
And food.
Maybe for my experience, also maybe like murder mysteries?
Yeah. So
would that be considered LARP?
It's funny because like there's some people who like, there are a lot of things that are very similar to LARP, and LARP is also very similar to other things, but like people get really up in arms about what is and isn't a LARP. So like reenactors and Ren Fair people sometimes hate it if you call what they do a LARP. Like they really, really hate it. So murder mystery, I think that's kind of like on the cusp of like, it's immersive. Well, it is immersive theater and it is kind of LARPy, and some are LARPier than others depending on how much they ask of the audience, right?
I'm like, is there a chart somewhere that we could be like, what, or a flow chart? Does your LARP have this so that you could go down? Because yeah, I had no idea. Like to me, if you're the way that you defined it, moving in a space, embodying character, I've done a murder mystery. So what would make something go from immersive theater to live action role play?
If I'm being cynical, then if you were playing the character, are you paying to play the character, or are you being paid to play the character?
Okay, yes.
Yeah, because some of it is like, and this is a little bit something I disagree with, but some people will define it by like, oh, how serious is the topic or the theme of the LARP or the experience, because LARP is so, people think about it as like, oh, it's a game and games are frivolous and they're like the purpose of games is to have fun, which we know is, games are much more complicated than that, just as any art form is much more complicated than that. So if you have a heavy subject matter, people are more likely to try to frame it as like an immersive experience, rather than like a live action role-playing game, because
it has a connotation of being light and frivolous and fun, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So yeah, I had no idea you got into LARP. So you said you were working on a blockbuster LARP?
I was playing in it.
Can you tell me about that? Because I want to know about that.
Oh man, there was the first of like several. I went to like several different runs of it, and also, so this was the first LARP I ever did, and I dove like right into the deep end because it was like a weekend long thing with costumes and all the well over 100 people. I met my partner there in character.
Nice.
People will have opinions about like forming relationships in that manner with people that you like meet in character, but like that happened and we're still together. But it was very much like I fell in love with it. And immersive theater was kind of where I started, and I guess with being in love with the idea of immersive experiences. And I've traveled around. I've gone to Scandinavia, I've gone to England to do LARP stuff, and I've done other places in the US. And then I started writing like smaller, free form style LARPs that you play in a few hours, and generally you don't have costumes. And I got really into that. And with like freeform LARP also, there's a lot of connection there to tabletop games. Like some of them, the line there is much blurrier because some of them will have mechanics that are similar to like a tabletop game, but you're, still like you're embodying the character, which I guess is where the difference is.
So if someone is interested in LARPing, where could they go to find information? Or is there's organizations that kind of help organize and put these things together?
This is going to be a little bit like a kind of a self-plug situation, but
sure, go for it.
So especially because right now our safe options for LARPing are limited. But I'm a judge and a committee member for the Golden Cobra Challenge, which is like a freeform LARP award. And this year, all of our entries were like had options. Like they were either written specifically to be remote play, or they were written so that like potentially you could play it in the same place, but like for these purposes, it's for remote play. It's a bunch of pretty simple. Like the whole idea behind Golden Cobra is that the setup is very minimal, so you don't have to read pages and pages and pages of backstory in order to jump in. Usually, it's just a few pages. And this year, like everything can be played with people who you're not sharing a house with. You can play it. Some of them are like epistolary. Some are done just like totally over voice. Some are a lot of them do use video, and some do some other like strange hybrid things. But that's a good place I would say to look right now, just because that's like what's available to us as players. Yeah, there are a lot of groups on Facebook that like just do LARP announcements and stuff. If you're interested in the hardcore Scandinavian stuff, NordicLARP.org. They don't do announcements of upcoming LARPs quite as often as they do like analysis of or critique of like LARPs that have just finished up. And I've written for them a couple of times, I think, by now. Yeah, I mean, it is kind of hard sometimes I do find that like often I find out about a cool LARP after it's all like been sold out, and that makes me sad.
Oh, that sucks. Yeah, I didn't even think about it. Like, we're talking about LARP because I wasn't expecting to talk about LARP at all, but this is such a fascinating world to me. I didn't even think about, oh yeah, there's a pandemic going on. How did that affect LARPers? Did you guys see more people signing up for LARPs, like now that you had the remote option available?
It's interesting because some people are very much like, I want to have like my gaming schedule really full, and I want to have as close as I can to the same immersive experiences that I was having before. And a lot of other people, and I think kind of myself included, screen fatigue is definitely a thing right now. It's a little bit hard for me to stay focused for longer LARPs especially because with a tabletop game, you can zone out a little bit. At least your face doesn't have to emote your character's emotions constantly. But in a LARP, since you're supposed to kind of be that person, and conveying emotion and intent over video is a little bit harder than like you don't have your full body range of motion and everything and body language to rely on. So I end up doing like a lot of hand gestures in this small area to try to like convey messages. But that can get kind of tiring. But what I liked about some of the games I saw in Golden Cobra were that it did it like a lot of people who were designing for that realized that people were in this headspace of like, I am tired of being on a computer all the time. How do we mitigate some of that fatigue?
Sure. So you've written some stuff for LARPs. What kind of scenarios are these like?
The first LARP, I think, that I wrote was called The Long Drive Back from Busan, which is my K-pop LARP, so it's like up to eight characters, all in the same boy group. And they're in a van going down to Busan to do this festival because their career is kind of their career is falling apart a little bit, and they all have their own drama and their tension amongst themselves. And this is kind of going to be like, if they don't do a great job with this performance, then they're screwed. And so it's the drive up, things that happen during the festival, and then the drive back, where things kind of fall apart in different ways, or maybe like they find new hope, depending, because there's like a very brief dice mechanic thing in there to determine some randomness. And that was the first time I submitted to Golden Cobra, and it won best game that incorporates meaningful non-romantic relationships. I always reverse the words in this title, but it's something like that. And it got like a decent amount of attention. And then from there, like I wrote, actually, maybe this was my first LARP. Maybe it was my second one, but it was called But Not Tonight. And that's a much longer one. Like Busan's like 3 hours tops, But Not Tonight would be like 6 hours usually.
Oof.
Which is rough. It's hard to run at cons because you don't have blocks that are that big usually. Mm-hmm. But it's the elevator pitch is it's Breakfast Club in a fallout shelter because it's 80s nuclear panic, and their high school students are all from different cliques, and they get stuck in their fallout shelter, and they don't know whether it was like a false alarm that the air raid siren went off or whether it's like the real thing, because situational things happen where they cannot communicate with the outside world. So they're like stuck with each other and their guidance counselor doing group therapy.
So those scenarios sound awesome. And those are your LARPs. Going into the TTRPG space, these kinds of scenarios, these kinds of game styles, is it something that you've been exploring in TTRPGs as well?
Yeah, so I think the LARP stuff has really influenced my tabletop work because I tend to favor lower mechanics and like really heavy narrative and player agency when it comes to kind of co-GMing, really, in a lot of ways. And collaborative storytelling and the idea of kind of playing to lose. So like not necessarily, oh, I'm going to this game with just the intention, like I want us to win, whatever that means in various role-playing scenarios, right? But to play for the drama and to encourage players to kind of, I don't know, make their characters suffer.
Oh my gosh, Clio. The characters that I love to play are usually the ones that have like inherent problems that just make the game hard for them, and I usually give them a death wish, like especially in one shots.
Oh yeah,
like if it's a one shot character, they're not gonna survive the one shot. So I love that too. I think, I don't know, do you find that just more interesting, more engaging? It's different usually than what the mainstream stuff is. Like what about that you're drawn to?
I think because I'm a big reader, and I'm just like a big media consumer in general, and everything that I get really obsessed with and that I love is usually pretty high angst or pretty high drama, and if you have to go into the mindset of not necessarily like needing, again, like to succeed or win or be victorious as a character, because, and part of that is like, often we also play as tabletop role players. We also play a lot of board games and stuff, or we did as children. And so we grow up thinking like games are something you win. You do have to kind of train yourself out of that thinking when you're at least like first getting into role-playing games where that's not necessarily the purpose. Especially because so many people play even like D&D very differently, right? Like some people do play it almost like a board game where it's like, I want to win this dungeon, I want to clear it. And video games, you have the same thing too, right? Like you're not going to go into a video game being like, I'm playing to lose, because then you're not going to like complete the video game. Although you could, like, in a BioWare game, I guess you could make choices that are going to make people pissed off at you and like lead to a more dramatic story in that way. It's weird because there's so much freedom in tabletop. Because, unlike LARP, your characters can experience like literally anything that you could find words to describe. And you can enter that headspace of being there pretty easily. Whereas like with LARP, you can, you could imagine that you're in a space and maybe that works really well, but it can be a little bit harder sometimes depending on like how out there the scenario is, like how fantastical, like how it's kind of like, actors in green screen. If you're acting with a tennis ball, it's going to be a different experience than acting across from a real actor.
Yeah, I've always wondered what that's like. So you mentioned the types of media that you consume that kind of have those kinds of narrative styles. I'm interested always in what people are like watching and consuming, because it's like the stuff that I consume tends to show up in my game. So what is the media that you enjoy?
There was a lot of horror, which probably explains a lot, because I do make some horror games, and even games that aren't technically within the genre, or at least influenced by it. So I'm co-designing a game called Home with Doug Lewandowski, who's one of the co-designers from Kids on Bikes and Teens in Space and Kids on Brooms. I always say Teens on Brooms. That's not right. It's Kids on Brooms. And it's we both watched Haunting of Hill House and loved it. And you can definitely see influence from that in there. Like, not only that it's like, oh, it's spooky haunted house stuff going on, because there's exploring a haunted house game. And we wanted to take some of the other, like, to have players find reasons to explore other types of drama within the horror. So give them kind of personal conflicts and things like backstories that they can pull from, so that it's not just like, oh, we are characters and there's scary things happening and jumping out at us, or like things aren't right in this house. It's like, oh, there's scary things happening in this house and they are reminding me for some reason of my personal life crisis that's going on, or like went on a year ago. I don't know. Horror is one of my favorite genres because you can explore grief through it really easily. And when you're talking about games, also like tabletop games, such as Dread's a good example, the one where you're pulling the Jenga blocks out. Because anything that requires that level of hand-eye coordination is already a horror game in my mind, even if it's like star-crossed.
It's at least a very anxiety-inducing game.
Yeah, because I'm not fantastic at it. I really enjoy exploring these other themes through the like machine of horror. And tabletop, you can play so much with player agency and like what can the characters actually accomplish. Are you going to end up getting them in more trouble by the decisions you make? Like there's just like so much fun space to explore there while also exploring some pretty heavy themes potentially.
This episode is brought to you by Kobold Press and Tome of Beasts 2, now available on the Kobold Press store. The publisher of the original smash hit Tome of Beasts, Kobold Press, wrangled a new horde of wildly original, often lethal, and highly entertaining 5e-compatible monsters to challenge new players and veterans alike. The Tome of Beasts 2 will bring 400 new monsters to 5th edition, from angelic enforcers, Sasquatch and Shriekbats, to psychic vampires, zombie dragons, and so much more. In addition to the Tome of Beasts 2 hardcover volume and PDFs, you can get monster pawns, VTT versions, and monster layers with beautiful maps. It also includes the work of Don't Split the Podcast Network's Celeste Konowich and James Introcaso. Find out more on koboldpress.com. I was going to say, I personally really enjoy now these types of games where it's not just, roll a dice, add a bonus. We're playing, like you said, playing to win. Exploring heavier themes or themes that are not generally thought of to be like a game, right? For somebody who might be interested in it, but has no real background in it yet, if that makes sense, like what kinds of games would you show them or introduce them to start getting into this kind of genre? Because like I had a friend who tried to run Bluebeard's Bride. And that game obviously deals with some darker themes. And if you're not familiar with it, I highly suggest you look up even just the folklore story. You look that up, you're going to understand the theme a little bit. And she ran it for people and they played it like D&D. They were trying to play to win. There's a question here. And it's probably a hard question too. It's like, how do you help people kind of like bridge that gap going from something like D&D to, hey, we are playing a exploring narrative-driven game?
So I think Powered by the Apocalypse games, which Bluebeard's Bride is, do a really good job of encouraging players to think of so-called negative consequences for the character as being interesting and fun to play on and fun and interesting, like worthy of exploring. And D&D to Bluebeard's Bride, I could see for a lot of people being a total kind of like culture shock thing, right? Because Bluebeard's Bride is it's a roller coaster, but it doesn't have a whole lot of highs. It's just all plummet. So I would suggest probably starting off with another Powered by the Apocalypse game that isn't quite as despair heavy as Bluebeard's Bride. Even, something like Masks, which is kind of on the surface seems pretty light. You are playing for drama there a lot of the time. Like, the materials ask you to tell a story together. And part of telling a story together is understanding that like not every move you make is going to work out. And that's not like a situation. It's like an opportunity. Like every failed roll is an opportunity to dive into character growth. And that, that's reflected in the mechanics to an extent. So I think Masks is a good segue into that realm. Like Thirsty Sword Lesbians, which, we just wrapped up the Kickstarter for that, and I was a stretch goal writer. They also do a good job in the materials of making it very clear that it's like, you can, it's not that you want to necessarily make your character suffer every step along the way, but things don't have to always work out for you in order for you to be like doing a good job at playing it, I guess. I'm trying to think of like other, like, oh, Monster Hearts. Yeah. So the spectrum, I think here, or, you know, and there's a gajillion Powered by the Apocalypse games, but from my personal experience, a good segue from D&D to like Bluebeard's Bride would be Masks, Thirsty Sword Lesbians, and then Monster Hearts. Because Monster Hearts is all about playing into the teen angst. And like you're all teen monsters and you're kind of there's a lot of toxic dynamics. So it teaches you how to play people who aren't necessarily like great people or like, you know, like basically the equivalent of hormonal teenagers who are just freaking out about everything because they're teenagers and they're also monsters. And dealing again, just like as a pretty important note, Monster Hearts does deal a lot with like sexuality and, you know, teen sexuality because you're all in high school and what it means to like be starting to discover that part of yourself. And there's interesting things to explore there as well. Like if you're playing an asexual character and if you are like an asexual player, because you know the game is so heavily focused on that. And you know, designer I think released some notes about that and specifically having to do with Monster Hearts 2, which was like the updated version of it. But it is kind of like there's room for a goofiness and humor there, but it is generally a pretty intense game in my experience. And I think once you've played Monster Hearts once and you felt like, yeah, I enjoyed this and I could go a little harder into into the emotional intensity, then you're good to go for Bluebeard's Bride.
I think that's an excellent scale. I've had experiences with Monster Hearts too. I think it's a really fun game. One of the things that I would say to a listener, if you're wanting to play this game or run this game, I think table buy-in on what you're running should be discussed well beforehand.
Oh, yeah.
So we talked about some of games that exist out there now. I would like to talk about some of your TTRPGs because I know that you have been writing. You mentioned you worked on Thirsty Sword Lesbians. What other stuff have you been up to?
Yeah, so the most recent one was a setting for Thirsty Sword Lesbians, which was called The Tragedies of Waldron Hall, and it's like gothic romance inspired and kind of, you know, monster lesbians and haunted mansion stuff. And I don't remember the order in which I've worked on things, but coming out in the question mark future, I wrote an adventure for Teens in Space, which is like a 4-part adventure, and that'll be coming out along with another adventure by Tim and Kristen Devine. And I don't know when that's going to come out exactly yet, but it's all written, and it's kind of noir influenced in some ways. Definitely like has a little bit of Cowboy Bebop feels in it, like Cowboy Bebop space noir stuff. And I had a really good time writing that, so I'm excited to see like how players react to it when it gets released. And I've also done, speaking of like Teens in Space, I wrote a setting for Kids on Bikes, which was one of the early things I did in tabletop stuff. That was like one of the pretty early things I wrote, which is called No Such Place as Koreatown. And it's, you know, very inspired by Annandale, Virginia, which is like our Koreatown area in Northern Virginia. And it has like Korean folklore woven into it and superstition and some of the drama and politics of 90s Annandale, where a lot of the white people in the area didn't really love that it was expanding so much, and like people were referring to it as Koreatown because they were racist. And some of the games do explore that more than others. Like some go really hard into that, and some don't touch that at all and just focus on the like Korean supernatural stuff. And then I've done some games that or I've contributed to some games that are like mainly geared towards kids or supposed to be like very family friendly. So I worked on I did a setting for Flip Tales, which is a pretty approachable role-playing game that's very like much for the whole family. And then recently I wrote the Mars colony setting for Magical Kitties Save the Day, which is available digitally, and I think next month it's being shipped out in physical copies. And that was a lot of fun because you're literally playing magical kitties.
That sounds awesome. I want to be a magical kitty. Of the things that you've done so far, has there been one particular piece or setting that you've been like really proud of, or you had like the most fun, or proud and fun? Are they different things? They don't have to be mutually exclusive. So,
I think so. The one that I am proud of and it was fun was the Hearts of Wulin setting / like adventure packet. I don't remember what we were calling exactly, but it's a bunch of adventure prompts and it's in this specific setting that's not like the default setting, and it was called Shadow of Chosen, and it's like a Korean historical setting for this martial arts powered by the apocalypse. Everything goes back to powered by the apocalypse game. And it has a lot to do with like injustice of that time period and classism and trying to like fight against these powers that are so much bigger than you. And it took a decent amount of research because I wanted to make sure I got everything right and I wasn't just pulling from knowledge that might not be up to date. But it also is something I'm legitimately excited to play with people one day because I made sure that every single prompt I put in there was something I'd be like really enthusiastic about playing. Like nothing was kind of like filler. Everything was, if I'm going to put this in here, I want it to be something that I'm 100% really excited about.
so on looking at your website, I also noticed that you offer consultation.
Mm-hmm.
So what kinds of consultation do you do?
So yeah, I do cultural consulting for games and kind of game adjacent things. And like there are a few things I do general kind of like looking for problems having to do with inclusion and diversity and representation. And then I do some like more specific things, like if somebody has a game that has Korean characters or themes having to do with Korea or Korean American or Asian American experiences, then I will read through that. And like there's a few other topics I kind of have on my roster of what I specialize in, including queerness and chronic illness and things along those lines, learning disabilities. And it looks very different depending on the project that I'm hired for. Because sometimes it's like somebody will send me a game and it's a fairly short game and it just takes a few hours and I read through it and I write up all my notes and I send them in. And if they have questions, then I'll like talk to them about that. The tone I take will change a lot based on like how much I know about the person or the people who have hired me. Like how willing are they to hear the feedback? Like how much do I have to like lead them into being comfortable with what I have to like say about it? And it's obviously like always better if they're like, I hired you because I actually want to like know what your opinion on this was and to get like your feedback so we can make changes. But like right now, like one of the big projects that I'm wrapping up is for a company that does education software for like the project I'm working on is kindergarten through 5th grade, I want to say. And it's games, like learning games that help teach reading comprehension, reading skills, and spelling. And it was like, it's a lot of, it's been a massive project because there's just like a lot of stuff to cover. It's interesting what things kind of will fall through the cracks sometimes. So those are the projects I really enjoy working on because like they're really interested in hearing like what are the things that we could be doing better.
Sure, because I think you are the first consultant that, or at least one that we're specifically talking about consultation right now that I've interviewed for the show. It's something that I think more people need to be aware of. You can hire people to look over your stuff, your writing, your scenarios, your games. And I want to kind of bring more awareness to that fact. If you wouldn't mind, could you explain at least a little bit why consultation is important to have people like another person look at what you're putting out there in the world?
Yeah. So a lot of times, especially if you're writing about settings or themes or places that aren't part of your lived experience, it's kind of like you don't know what you don't know, right? So you could say or write something that is harmful without realizing at all that like it's going to be harmful for people who do have that lived experience. And part of it's like it's a big relief to also not have to do that work yourself, to like give it to somebody else and be like, okay, I need somebody who knows what they're doing and knows what to look for, so that I'm not doing guesswork just like, and scrambling to do all this research. Because you should do research anyway, but you can't get like a doctorate in a subject every time that you make contents about it. And I've just seen, there's some like really problematic content out there in games and in other things where if they had just had a consultant on board, and sometimes they do have a consultant on board, but they brought them on very late in the process when it's too late to change anything. So if you have, for instance, like if you have art that ended up looking stereotypical of like a certain like ethnic group, for instance, and you didn't realize that you were, the illustrations were playing into those stereotypes, but you already paid for all that art and you don't have any budget left to buy new art. And so now you have a consultant who's saying, this art's no good, it's a problem, but you can't really do anything about it. Like what you were expecting was that they would say like, oh, maybe you should phrase this like one sentence that you have in chapter 9 differently, when really it's kind of like, actually, some of the foundational materials here are a problem, and some of your basic mechanics are actually a problem. If you bring someone on that late in the process, they're not going to be able to like help you that much. Or they'll be able to tell you what's wrong, but you might not have the resources left because you've used them all already to actually change it.
So if you're okay with sharing, what's a common problem that you've caught in your work as a consultant?
I think a very common one that I've seen across like, several projects that are mine, several projects that are not like ones that I've been hired on, but I know about, is kind of handling or just not being aware of the impacts of colonialism. Because sometimes people won't know that such and such country invaded this other country that they were writing about and terrible things happened. And they'll have something in the content that is just obviously very oblivious of that and kind of hurtful for the people who were colonized, perhaps praising the colonizers in a way, or like saying like that the country that was colonized should learn something from the colonized. There's like all sorts of things that could go wrong there, right? But there's so often just a lack of knowledge of the impact of all sorts of stuff that has to do with colonizers coming in and just wrecking stuff. That can be stuff that's harder to catch if you just don't. Again, like you don't know what you don't know, right? And so like even like in the language that you're using, sometimes like certain vocab words that you're using they'll have like their roots in something that's actually like really problematic and hurtful and maybe really, really dated. Like people who, like, for instance, I don't think I've ever run into this in my consulting work, but I've heard other people having to deal with this. People still using things like Oriental as a way to describe people.
I think I learned about that in 9th grade because I had no idea. And, it's one of those things where it's just so ingrained in just what you grew up with. Like you said, you don't know what you don't know. And if it's just the pervasive terminology that's used in around you, and it's one of those things where I didn't realize, even though I'm like have Asian heritage myself. And it wasn't until like my 9th grade English teacher was like, you know, not to me specifically, but to the class, because I think it came up in reading. You're saying even before you have the written game, you're starting to develop a game. How would I go about trying to find a consultant? Like, what should I look for in a consultant?
So I have a list or a thread on Twitter that I circulate. I was going to say once a month, but I neglected it for like the past couple of months. But I try to retweet it every month. And I ask consultants and sensitivity readers to add their information there and like a little bit about what they specialize in, so that people can browse the list and see, okay, I'm writing something and I really need somebody who is familiar with Southeast Asia to like do a read on this, because there's some themes that come up that I don't know enough about and it's not from my lived experience. Then you can go and find somebody who does that. And often, like, Twitter is honestly, for better or worse, a great one of the main resources right now for being hired and also finding people to hire for these types of things. Is if you go out and like tweet like, I need a reader to do like to cover like this kind of thing, then people will retweet it and you'll usually find somebody. And it is like it can be really hard sometimes to know what you need to have, what you need to have covered in your material. Because sometimes it's surprising, like what stuff you accidentally put in there that's not cool, that you didn't realize was not cool, and might have nothing to do with the main topics that you want to hire somebody to deal with. Yeah, there's a lot of people out there who do that kind of work of all varying experience levels, and depending on how intense and like expansive your project is, you might want to hire someone who's like super duper experienced, or you might want to hire someone who's just getting into the field, but they have the lived experience there so they can tell you what you need to know. Yeah, there's a lot of people out there who do the work, or who are willing to do the work.
How does one start becoming a consultant? In my mind, my question goes, well, I have certain lived experiences that I know I could speak to. For instance, poverty. Near homelessness, but I've never done sensitivity reading or consulting before. Do I have quote unquote authority to talk about those experiences and like read over something?
I think it's always good to have a mentor. Like that's, I would say, is like the number one important thing for getting into it, is finding somebody who has experience in that field of work, and either like setting up one-on-one meetings with them, or just like reading through a lot of their, like, for instance, James Mendez Hodes is a good friend and colleague of mine, and his blog, which I think is just like his name.com probably, is just like full of amazing articles that really give you, and he has like, he cites other people's work also, so it's like a good launching point, like it's a good starting point to finding other sources that you need. But he covers a lot of really, interesting stuff about playing somebody of a different ethnicity. And I will like say, like as a little asterisk here, like playing a different ethnicity in a game, it's like with your friends or at a con, like those two things are very different. Like if you're playing with strangers versus are you playing with friends, versus then like are you streaming it for the world? Are you making then it's like goes up to like, are you making money off of it? Like all of these things are different, right? Because then it becomes more like entertainment if you're streaming for the money, living that dream life where you get paid to play characters. And so I would say like starting off by like reading what different consultants and sensitivity readers have posted like on their blogs or articles that they've written elsewhere, and then ideally getting to have some conversations with them about how they approach their work. And just like, even just like the, technical things about like, okay, do you have a spreadsheet? How many spreadsheets? Like, what are you putting on the spreadsheet exactly? What should you be charging? Because there's so many like little minutia things that nobody knows when they're first going into it, that you just need to like ask other people about. So many, when I got into it, it was just so much of like me mostly asking Mendez questions incessantly. And then finding, other friends who have been consultants, and just, comparing notes, asking them how they like approach various, obstacles that they ran into before. And it did, my work as a consultant started more casually, I think, where people would just ask like, hey, can you like read through this? Like if like a friend would be like, and I generally say you should always like pay your consultants, but sometimes, you are reading something over for a close friend, and I would do that, and they would really benefit from the notes I gave. And that was kind of how I segued into doing it professionally, is by doing it more casually, and then just learning from other people. And then part of it was stuff I learned in grad school and undergraduate school. I just like everything kind of accumulated into my experience now, and it just led to kind of like bigger and bigger jobs as a consultant.
Much like your TTRPG and LARPing and all the stuff that happens, it's just like eventually just Katamari balls into, wow, I'm here now. This is what I do.
Yep.
Well, Clio, this has been a great chat. Do you have anything you would like to plug right now? Anything going on? Where can people find you? What are you up to?
So you can find me, I think, pretty much everywhere, from Patreon to Instagram to Twitter, as CYS Davis. And I just wrapped up a Kickstarter, so I'm really proud of that. And while you can't pledge to that anymore because it's done, it will be released on Strange Horizons next year, like later next year. And it's an interactive fiction anthology called Strange Lusts, Strange Loves. And it's gonna be a few short, fun, speculative, like romance and sexuality related stories that are interactive. It'll be about almost all of them will be available for free on Strange Horizons eventually.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to get you back on to talk about that because that is a subject we didn't even get to. All right, well, everybody, you're gonna hear Clio come back to talk about that because I'm also interested in romance games. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Real quick before we go into our normal end of the show roll, I just wanted to throw it out there that I, Amber, have an enamel pin Kickstarter currently running until January 15th of 2021. If you or someone you know likes enamel pins plus Magic the Gathering crossed with magical girl anime aesthetic, please check it out. You can find it on my Twitter @RocketOrca or by searching Magical Lands on Kickstarter. On Twitter, you can also find the other co-hosts of this show. Kenny is @Wolfmere and John is @CrosswaysGM. Tabletop Babble is part of the Geekspective Network. Go to geekspective.com to check out all our other shows or follow us on Twitter @Geekspective. Our theme music was provided by the Battle Bards. Elderwood Academy are artisans who craft amazing gaming products, including dice towers, dice trays, dice boxes, deck boxes, dice, and more. All products are crafted to look like spellbooks, scroll cases, codexes, and other awesome fantasy gear. Monsters, the ubiquitous adversaries in our gaming lives brought to life from our imaginations and delivered in games, books, movies, and more. Elderwood Academy has drawn on their inspiration and partnered with Abbott's Hollow Studios to bewitch a series of spellbook gaming boxes with unique, handcrafted monster faces and personalities. Crafted in the crypts of Abbott's Hollow Studios, the monsters adorned on the Spellbook Monster Edition are handcrafted from rich leather and feature custom-made glass eyes to make each one the only of its kind. The Spellbook itself is the classic build you've come to love from Elderwood, carved out of a single block of hardwood and finished with thoughtful details to delight you. Go to elderwoodacademy.com/don't split to take a peek at these monstrous spellbooks. Hero Forge offers fully customizable tabletop miniatures with dozens of fantasy races and thousands of parts to choose from. Their easy-to-use design tool lets you build your perfect miniature online using a fully 3D, in-depth character creator right in your web browser. Custom minis can be made in a variety of materials, including plastic and metal options. They also offer downloadable model files so you can 3D print your own unique designs at home. Hero Forge is constantly expanding their catalog of customization options, adding new parts every week and major features like races and custom posing on a regular basis. Visit heroforge.com to start designing your custom miniature today. And check back often, new content is added every week.